There is a version of your life sitting untouched right now. The business you haven't started, the message you haven't sent, the move you haven't made. And you tell yourself, quite reasonably, that you're simply waiting for the right time. Waiting until you have more savings, more experience, more certainty that it will work. It sounds like patience. It sounds like wisdom. And yet, if you look honestly at how long you've been waiting and how little closer you feel to actually moving, a stranger possibility begins to surface. What if the right time was never actually the thing you were waiting for? The story we tell ourselves is comforting because it makes inaction sound like strategy. We say we're being careful, responsible, prudent, gathering just a little more information before we leap. And there is, of course, real wisdom in preparation. But here is the question worth sitting with. How much information would actually be enough? If you're honest, you already know the uncomfortable answer. There is no version of the plan detailed enough, no amount of research thorough enough, to produce the one thing you're actually asking for. Not more information, but a guarantee. Proof, delivered in advance, that the outcome will be good. And no timeline, however patient, has ever produced that. Because the right time was never a date on a calendar. It was a disguise for a demand the universe has never once agreed to meet. This is the illusion worth dismantling first, that hesitation is a rational response to insufficient data. In reality, most of the decisions people describe as still gathering information have long since crossed the threshold where more information would meaningfully change the outcome. What's actually happening is something psychologists call intolerance of uncertainty, not a simple dislike of the unknown, which everyone feels to some degree, but a specific, measurable difficulty tolerating the mere possibility of a negative outcome, regardless of how small that possibility actually is. Researchers studying this trait have found something almost paradoxical. People high in intolerance of uncertainty don't necessarily overestimate the odds that something will go wrong. They simply cannot bear that the odds exist at all. A 5% chance of failure feels, to this part of the mind, functionally identical to a 50% chance, because the problem was never really about probability. It was about the unbearable fact of not knowing for certain. And here is where the deeper architecture of the waiting begins to reveal itself. Because a guarantee, by definition, cannot be found through more research. It can only be manufactured after the fact, through hindsight, which means the strategy of waiting for certainty isn't actually a strategy for making a better decision. It's a strategy for making a decision only in the one moment it's no longer a decision at all, after the outcome is already known and the risk has quietly evaporated behind you. The economist Frank Knight drew a distinction nearly a century ago that still cuts to the center of this problem. He separated the world into risk, situations where the odds are knowable, like a hand of cards, where you can calculate your way to an optimal choice, and uncertainty, situations where the odds themselves are unknown and unknowable, because the future hasn't been written yet. Almost every meaningful decision in a human life, who to love, what to build, where to plant yourself, belongs to the second category, not the first. And yet the mind, desperate for solid ground, keeps trying to treat uncertainty as if it were merely risk in disguise, as if enough analysis could eventually convert the unknowable into the knowable. It can't. No amount of spreadsheet modeling will tell you, with certainty, whether the relationship will last, whether the business will find its market, whether the leap will land. At some point, the analysis runs out of new information to offer, and all that's left is the decision itself, standing there, unprotected by data, waiting for you to choose anyway. This is the moment most people quietly retreat from, not because they've concluded the risk is too high, but because they've discovered something more uncomfortable, that no one is ever going to hand them the permission slip they were hoping to find. And so the waiting continues, not as a pause before action, but as a slow, comfortable substitute for it. To understand why this substitute feels so persistently comfortable, you have to look at what waiting actually protects. Every unmade decision, like every unfinished project, remains suspended in a kind of infinite potential. As long as you haven't started the business, it hasn't failed. As long as you haven't sent the message, you haven't been rejected. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, writing about anxiety nearly 2 centuries ago, described this precisely. Human beings are creatures suspended between possibility and actuality, and the vertigo of that suspension, what he called the dizziness of freedom, is often mistaken for a sign that something is wrong, when it is actually just the raw feeling of being free to choose without a script. Kierkegaard's answer to this vertigo wasn't more certainty. It was what he called the leap, the recognition that some decisions can never be justified in advance by reason alone, and must instead be made the way a person steps off a ledge into water they cannot see the bottom of, not because they've calculated it's safe, but because they've decided that living fully requires stepping forward without the guarantee. This reframes the entire subject, because it means the paralysis so many people experience isn't a failure of courage in the dramatic sense. It isn't cowardice, exactly. It's something quieter and more universal, a mind doing exactly what minds are built to do, which is seek safety, and mistaking the absence of certainty for the presence of danger. The nervous system did not evolve in a world of long-term career decisions and untested business ideas. It evolved to detect immediate threat, and it applies that same ancient alarm system to modern uncertainty, even when the modern uncertainty carries no risk to your literal survival. This is why the fear of starting something new can feel, physiologically, disproportionate to what's actually at stake, because the body isn't measuring the actual danger. It's measuring the unfamiliarity and treating unfamiliarity itself as a kind of threat, regardless of what it might lead to. But there is a second, quieter mechanism at work beneath the fear of failure, and it may be even more powerful than the fear itself, the fear of finding out. As long as the idea remains untested, it remains, in your own private imagination, undefeated. The moment you act, the moment you actually try, the infinite possibility collapses into a single, finite, judgeable outcome, and some part of the mind would rather protect the fantasy of success than risk discovering the real, more limited truth. This is why so many people can speak with genuine passion about the thing they're planning to do, yet feel a strange reluctance the moment an actual opportunity to begin appears. The plan was never only a plan. It was also, quietly, a shield, protecting a version of the future that cannot be disproven because it has never been attempted. And this is where the psychology reveals something almost backwards from what our culture usually teaches about motivation and readiness. We tend to believe that confidence comes first and action follows, that you need to feel ready before you can reasonably begin. But research into what's sometimes called self-perception theory suggests the relationship often runs in the opposite direction. People don't act because they feel confident. People come to feel confident, in large part, because they've already acted and observed themselves doing so. The nervous system doesn't build trust in you through your intentions. It builds trust through evidence, and evidence can only be generated by movement, however small, however imperfect. Which means the readiness you're waiting for isn't a precondition for beginning. It's frequently a consequence of having already begun. This changes what waiting for the right time actually means once you see it clearly. It isn't patience. It's a bargain struck with an anxious part of the mind, a bargain that promises, once I feel certain enough, I will act. But that certainty was never coming, because certainty about an unlived future doesn't exist to be found. It has to be built, retroactively, out of the very experience the waiting was designed to postpone. There is an old idea, present in various forms across many traditions, about the sculptor and the uncarved block, the notion that inside every unshaped piece of stone exists, simultaneously, every statue that could ever be carved from it. As long as the stone remains untouched, it holds infinite forms within it. The moment the first cut is made, most of those forms are lost forever, narrowed permanently into whatever the sculptor chooses to reveal. It's a frightening thought if you dwell on it too long. Every choice is also, necessarily, the death of every other choice you didn't make. But it's also the only way anything has ever actually been created. No statue has ever emerged from a block of marble that was simply admired, endlessly, for its potential. The potential only becomes real the instant someone accepts the loss of everything else it could have been and begins. This is, perhaps, the real and uncomfortable truth hidden beneath the desire for a guarantee. Certainty and creation cannot coexist. To create anything, a career, a relationship, a piece of work, a version of yourself you haven't yet becoming, is to act before the evidence exists, and to accept that the evidence will only ever arrive after the choice has already been made, not before it. This is not recklessness. Recklessness ignores risk entirely. This is something closer to courage in its original, quieter sense. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act while the fear and the uncertainty are still fully present and entirely unresolved. So perhaps the right time was never a specific moment waiting to be identified through more research, more readiness, more proof. Perhaps it was only ever a story, told by a mind trying to protect itself from the one truth no amount of preparation can undo, that every meaningful step forward in a human life is taken without a guarantee, into a future no one, however careful, has ever been able to fully see in advance. And so the question worth carrying out of this isn't, when will you finally feel ready enough to begin? It's this: if no guarantee is ever coming, and none ever has for anyone who has built a meaningful life before you, what would you begin today if you finally let yourself stop waiting for one?